Thank you, everybody. It's very kind. Well, first of all, welcome to all of you who are visiting to the greatest city on earth, my hometown. I've been gone a long time, but I'm still a Chicagoan at heart. And also welcome to a very special thing, which is the inaugural event of Fortune Brainstorm Reinvent. Our team is very excited to be here, and we're very excited that you're here. This conference is rooted in the idea that leaders in every industry are confronting the need to transform their organizations for the challenges and opportunities of the digital age. We'll put a spotlight on many legacy or incumbent, dare I say, older companies who are doing fascinating things to reinvent themselves and to make themselves fresh for the future. We'll talk about best practices and how older companies can learn from newer companies, and as well as newer companies recognizing how important it is to learn from companies that have stood the test of time. Before we get started, I want to recognize my two editorial co-chairs of this event, Fortune Features editor Matt Heimer. Where are you, Matt? Matt, did you not come to Brainstorm Reinvent? Well, maybe he's getting ready somewhere. And I know that Beth Coet also is not in the room because she's getting ready for an interview right now. But Matt Heimer and Beth Coet are my two Fortune colleagues. And also we have a guest co-chair for reInvent, former vice chair of GE, Beth Comstock. Beth is not a Fortune writer, but she is a writer, and she has just published her book, Imagine It Forward: Courage, Creativity, and the Power of Change. So welcome, Beth. Are you in the room? Okay, good. Every 3 years, McKinsey & Company senior partners elect a first among equals to the role of global managing partner. I'd now like to introduce Kevin Snyder, who earlier this year was elected to that role. He's been with McKinsey for almost 3 decades, and he says his first order of business is getting out his searchlight and his spotlight to get a better focus on McKinsey. Please welcome Kevin Snyder. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. After Glasgow, I think this probably is the best city in the world, so I'm prepared to accept that. When I thought about the subject at hand, reinvention, I decided to reach back into the archives for an analogy that two colleagues, Dick Foster and Sarah Kaplan, used to really capture the essence of how one thinks about reinvention. And it's from the shipbuilding industry, and indeed the era of sail or steam. This is the SS Savannah. I don't know if any of you have been on the SS Savannah. It looks like a young audience, so probably not. But at the turn of the 19th century, this was state of the art for the world of steam power. And the SS Savannah in 1818, in May of 1818, set out to cross the Atlantic and became the first steamship to do so, sort of. You may notice there's some sails there. And when she crossed the ocean, those sails were up for most of the journey. They actually only used steam for 80 hours. And as you recall, back at the turn of the century, in the 19th century, the main form of travel back and across the Atlantic for goods and services was this. This is the Glenavon, built in Aberdeen, a fine Scottish ship. She could cross in about 29 days. The SS Grampian crossed in about the same time, but essentially was under sail power. But you'll notice the date. 50 years had elapsed from this SS Savannah, the first steamship to cross. So in those 50 years, all that happened was this. But of course, steam power was being developed. It was being reinvented. And by this point in time, suddenly they realized if you were a tall ship, you needed to do something. So what did you do when you reinvented your ship and you want to compete with steam? You did this. This is the Prussian, a fine German vessel, except it sank. And there's a moral to this tale. It sank, but it was nevertheless the record holder for many, many transatlantic and other traverses. And as you can see here, it has 5 sets of sails, a revolution in wind power. And that bought them some time. In fact, it bought them quite a lot of time until this thing came along. This is the SS Grampian. This was built in Glasgow, 1907. And you can actually look at her closely. You can see she still has masts for sails because the inventor of this steam-powered record-setting ship, which held the record from Montreal to Glasgow over many years, felt they still needed the comfort, the security of having the sails. But of course, if you were a tall ship owner, you knew you could beat this. You knew you just needed to reinvent the sail ship one more time. So this is what you did. The Thomas Lawson, a fine vessel, 7 masts of sails, 7. Launched in exactly the same year as the SS Grampian. But sadly, 1 year after being launched off the Isles of Scilly, it sank. And the only survivor, Captain Turner, commander of the vessel. The moral of the tale, when that ship went down, so did the age of sail. But it took a lot longer than people expected for steam to gain dominance. And sometimes that's the case. Bill Gates says we often underestimate what happens over a decade, but overestimate what can happen in the next 2 years. And in that period, there is false security. Somehow or other, people take comfort, well, it wasn't that bad after all. It took 100 years for this to transpire and end as it did so tragically. And I think far too many business leaders still take comfort that the time is there because they can point to the things that didn't play out in the next 2 years. But when you look over the decade, it looks a bit different. So as we have our conversations today, I think there's a number of topics I'm sure will come up. I'm sure we'll talk about digital and what that's doing to revolutionize business. Digital is to this century what electricity was to the last century, so there should be no surprise in seeing digital revolutionize what's going on. I'm sure we'll talk about automation and robotics. About 60% of all jobs face more than 30% of the activities changing. 60% of all jobs will see more than 30% of activities changing. So there is clearly a revolution going on that automation and robotics will drive. Within 2 years or within a decade, let's see. I'm sure we could talk about the Internet of Things or blockchain, distributed ledgers. The hype is all over, mostly around Bitcoin, but actually the real applications, security of supply chain, and lots of other applications that we're going to see in the decade, and maybe even within the next 2 years, that make use of the underlying capability. AI and quantum computing, that one is further out, but when quantum computing hits, then we will be able to do the moonshot of solving things like cancer, because the computing power, the limit, Moore's law will be over. It will no longer be relevant. It will have been proven wrong for the first time. But of course, the biggest technology shift that's going to happen, people, culture, the way business chooses to embrace or not embrace the changes that are occurring. So the question is simple. Will you be the captain of the Thomas Lawson, or will you be powering forward with the SS Grampian, one of Glasgow's finest? I think we're going to have a great conversation. I look forward to joining you for it. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Kevin.